Welcome to Thinkin', a podcast series by Kautilya School of Public Policy.
A very real debate. Sardar Patel and Prime Minister Nehru, people talk about their debate. But Nehru made certain judgment calls about those things. No, countries look at it as, here is my interest, is India useful? Effective policymakers are the ones that realize when circumstances change that Pakistan was. When people say self-reliance and Atmanirbharta, it is unfeasible to do self-sufficiency.
Hello, I am Nirmal Ganesh. Today our guest is Dr. Tanvi Madan, a distinguished international relations academic and author. She is a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. She also hosts Global India podcast. Hello ma'am. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Yes ma'am. So how do you feel like being in Hyderabad, and did you get any chance to try local food?
I have already had a chance to try local food, particularly biryani, and I had some balushahi as well. But I'm looking forward, I'm here for another few days, having even more food. If there's something other than foreign policy that makes me passionate, it is food. So I'm very glad to be here.
You should definitely try apricot delight. It's a famous dessert here in Hyderabad.
I will.
Ma'am, we know that you hold doctorate in public policy and masters in international relations. Just for our viewers, can you walk us through your journey, like why foreign policy interested you?
So I grew up in India in the 1980s, and it was a very different India. It was before India really started opening up economically. But there were a lot of developments happening in the world. This is when the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, so the Cold War was quite close. We used to have Afghan refugees in Delhi, where I grew up. You also had at that point some pretty significant, conferences being held in Delhi. You had the Asian Games at that time. So it wasn't like the world wasn't there, but it was more and more was happening. Then towards the late 80s, you had these really momentous developments, including the fall of the Soviet Union, the kind of many communist regimes collapsing across Eastern Europe. So, and then there was the Gulf War in the Middle East. So, we're saying today that there's so many crises happening in the world, multiply that by quite a bit, and that was kind of that late 80s, early 90s period. So that was when I was really thinking about, why are these things happening in the world? So I was always engaged in kind of foreign policy issues. In Delhi, you're always aware also of government, of diplomacy. And so, those things captured my attention. I knew that government mattered, government decisions, but my father was in the private sector. So I understood that, the world outside government as well. But when he was thinking about the corporate world, government would affect that. So this idea that the world mattered for India, that developments outside the world mattered for India, that India was, had to think about what was happening beyond its borders, was something that I was quite engaged with. This is a very nerdy thing to say, but one of my favorite TV shows used to be, and we didn't have as many channels as you guys do, let alone internet, but one of my favorite programs there used to be this program on Fridays called The World This Week, which Pranay Roy used to host. Okay. That was my favorite, and it wasn't an opinion show, it was just here is what is happening in the world. So I was interested, and then for me, I did my undergraduate BA in history in Delhi at Lady Shri Ram College. We did history from not just Indian history, we had Chinese history, Japanese history, Russian history, European, a little. It was always funny because they, even though this was after the Cold War, they'd still get you to choose, you had to choose between doing Russian or American history. So, my exposure went up, and then I first started working. I worked actually in the technology industry, okay. And I was in Bangalore. But there you got a real sense of India's and Bangalore being connected to the kind of global economy. So my interest, like I said, in the world continued, but the reason I'm saying this aspect is, one thing, working on the technology side, it might seem strange in those days to be going from interest in foreign policy, but it taught me that you can't just do, international relations, it also, or foreign policy, it was connected to economics, it was connected to technology policy. So after that, I did my, I always knew I wanted to do an IR degree, and I went for international relations to the US to do my master's. And then after that, once you're on a track, you tend to stay on a track. Worked for a few years at the Brookings Institution, then got my PhD. Why did I get a PhD? It was because I'm really passionate about research. But also, somebody once told me you need a hunting license in this business, and your PhD was that. And especially to your kind of female listeners out there, it was particularly important that as a woman, and a young woman at that, sometimes you need the credential, or people take you more seriously when you have the PhD after your name. But it comes down to I was passionate about the subject. So it's a very long way of saying answering your question, but I thought it was important for your listeners.
I think I can relate it with myself because I am engineer myself, and slowly gaining interest in international relations. Maybe going forward even I'll get my hunting license. So
I will say, I know we want to get on to other topics, but I will say there's no one pathway. So you don't need to get a PhD for interest. You don't even need to get an IR degree. To me, it's interesting that as an engineer you're interested in public policy. That's great. It's an interdisciplinary world, so you don't need a PhD. The interest is great as well.
So, ma'am, moving to our topic, Indian public in general are a bit confused on Pandit Nehru's role in shaping India's policy towards China. How do you assess his role?
So, I think like all policymakers' decisions, it's a complex role. One of the things I learned when I started doing research before I was researching my dissertation that became my book, I had the impression that I think a lot of people did. Why did he make such wrong decisions? Why didn't he understand that China was a threat? This is so naive. As I was doing research in the archives, and now there are a lot of Indian archives open, some are available on the net. It's worth actually going and looking, because you start learning a little bit more about policymakers' constraints. We always think, when we are thinking about options in hindsight, that the perfect options are available. And sometimes policy making, you learn when you're looking back at how policymakers, not just Nehru, but from every political stripe you look at this, policymakers are essentially choosing between a bunch of bad options, or they have to make trade-offs, as in they don't have all the options. So I think what my assessment of Nehru and China changed as well, which is two or three things struck me. Is one, it's not that he didn't, or his government didn't understand that China posed a challenge. The debate was what kind of challenge, how long would it take. So there's a infamous note he wrote in 1952 saying, China is not a major problem right now, but give it 10 years. And he was actually right. By I think the challenge and the criticism one could make, that was where I changed. It wasn't that I thought he was naive or didn't understand the challenge. I think the assessment that where he went wrong is, one, to think that agreements themselves would ensure peace, that China would stick to its words, that China actually saw things the same way India did. So he would do what I call mirror imaging. He was saying, India is a newish independent country, old civilization but new country. It needs time to develop and grow, and so therefore China is the same, and so it will also want peace. So one is this mirror imaging, which I think he did, and it proved to be inaccurate. I think the second thing is, when he says, look, the China challenge is coming, then you should be focused on doing something about it, and not just depend on these agreements to ensure that they stick to that word. So I think, to me, that is what you also learn, though, is they want easy choices. So I can sit back here and say they should have been spending more on defense, but at that time there was a very real debate. Sardar Patel and Prime Minister Nehru, people talk about their debate, but people talk about only parts of it. It's worth going and reading their exchange, because really what it is about the debates that we have to this day about India's China policy. How much money do you spend on defense? How much money do you spend on development? How much attention should you focus on the Pakistan threat? How much attention should you focus on the China threat? And then how far to go in alliance with the US, and how far to go in or not go in partnership with others, how Atmanirbhar or self-reliant to be. To this day, we are having these discussions around the world about India's foreign policy, its China policy. So Nehru made certain judgment calls about those things, some of which, in fact, people are still making to this day. But some of that left, I think, left India unprepared to deal with the China challenge. So I think by the late 50s, the China challenge was very apparent. It was being dealt with. But I do think on the broader strategic side, it's not that they didn't understand the challenge. I think it is in the approach and the immediacy of the challenge that they should have perhaps made better decisions. And I think that's something to be thinking about even now, that it's not that people don't think. You have to sometimes take advantage of a window of opportunity to get certain things done.
I'm sure this answer will give a bit clarity to our viewers. Moving to next question. You have mentioned different leaders and policy makers in your book. Whom do you think played a key role in building strong India-US ties?
You know, that's a very interesting question. I think many did, because I don't think I think leaders matter tremendously from the top level, because they the political leaders send a direction down. So they can either send a direction saying we want to cooperate with the US, or they can say don't cooperate with the US. But it's not just 0-1, right? It's not a binary. People aren't, people often say so and so is pro-India or anti. No, countries look at it as, here is my interest, is India useful or helpful or not? And so I think in that, and then they say to their bureaucracies, I want you to do, cooperate with India. Or people will say on the Indian side, I had thought I wanted to be more cautious with the US, but I am going to take a chance. So in terms of that, I think the leaders who you really see start to change how the US had seen in the time I look at, which is kind of between 47 and 79, I think the ones that kind of pivoted things were, people often look at President Kennedy later in the 60s, but I thought the change comes in President Eisenhower, where he starts to think, and I think the biggest thing that made an impression on Indian leaders from a US leader was he himself, the first term of the Eisenhower administration, he's the one who went on what they call pactomania, signing a lot of alliances. But by his second term, he came to the conclusion that you don't have to have with us or against us. It is okay to be non-aligned while you align with us on certain things that are of joint interest. So you start to see that change where he's willing to say, we don't have to agree on everything. And if you don't agree, I am not going to punish you for it. I do think also in terms of leaders and how it made a difference. Prime Minister Nehru was influential in both ways. One, in terms of setting in a skepticism of the US to some extent that exists to this day. So as much as people have moved away from the Nehruvian ideal in many ways, on this, that skepticism that he had remains to this day. But it was also another aspect, which is like effective policymakers are the ones that realize when circumstances change, you must change policy. So the fact that when India needed to switch because of the China challenge, because of India's economic needs, he was willing to work with the US despite his own earlier skepticism. So to me, both those leaders in the beginning, and then, as I said, relationships are never made on one leader. The ones that sustain are across time. So, you could also think of leaders who are influential in the opposite way, and people will point to mostly President Nixon and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. But you also have to look deep, and when they both first came to office, they actually weren't against the relationship. So I think it's always, I mentioned the two, Eisenhower and Nehru, but not just at the leader level. They were crucial people at the bureaucratic and the ministerial level that were important as well. But the reason I mentioned the political leaders is usually the messaging comes from the top down.
Ma'am, during Cold War, there were other factors affecting India-US ties, like Pakistan and Soviet Union. Could you briefly touch upon how did they influence India-US ties?
So it's very interesting that, my book is called Fateful Triangle, but even within triangles, there are always these other factors that shape this kind of three-country relationship. I think Pakistan and Soviet Union in some ways had a similar effect, in the sense that one of the things I try to do in the book is lay out what are the circumstances under which the US and India actually have come close together to balance China. And the reason I came at that is because it has contemporary relevance as well. But I also look at what are the things that prevent the US and India from getting close to each other to balance China, or what have been the obstacles, what has slowed down the progress of cooperation. And this is where to some extent the US, Soviet Union, or today Russia and Pakistan come in, which is India and the US sometimes shared a threat perception of China, but they disagreed about how to deal with that threat perception. So for instance, the US thought in the time I looked at that Pakistan was part of the solution, that India and Pakistan should make up to focus on the China challenge. India thought Pakistan is part of the China problem because China and Pakistan had a very close relationship. On the flip side, the US saw China-Soviet relations as a problem. India saw Russia as, or Soviet Union as a balancer against China. So these two kind of, both India had a partnership with the Soviet Union that ended up being problematic for the US, and the US had a relationship with Pakistan that ended up being problematic. When there was real convergence, they managed to overcome those differences. But at times, that difference actually, along with some other differences, did end up slowing how much the US and India were willing to cooperate with each other.
Moving a bit to Indo-Pacific, India is part of Quad. What do you think it can offer to the grouping and get benefits in return?
I think the reason the Quad exists, and after all it is actually a Japanese idea, not even a US idea, the reason the Quad exists is these four countries felt a need. One, they had a shared vision of what Asia Indo-Pacific should look like, which is not a region dominated only by China where Beijing gets to set the rules. That they also have a shared vision that this is a vision that this is a region where the rules should largely be followed, where countries are free to make choices. Doesn't matter whether you are, not a democracy or democracy, but where largely you are free to make your choices. So there's a shared kind of understanding. There's also amongst these four countries, and India included, shared concern about rising China's behavior complicating that vision, or China not agreeing to that vision, wanting a unipolar Asia where it gets to dominate. So there's a shared convergence on vision. There's a shared, and I notice I use the word shared, not identical, because there are differences, but nonetheless shared view of the concern. And there is this also shared sense that existing mechanisms, ASEAN, bilateral relationships, bilateral alliances in the case of the US, are insufficient to deal with the challenge. And so you see that these four countries have also decided it's not that existing mechanisms are useless, but they're not sufficient. So you need these like-minded countries that share that vision and concerns to act together and cooperate. So for India, in some ways, the Quad is a force multiplier. India has strong bilateral relationships with each of the partners. It also has trilaterals in some case. But bringing together these four maritime democracies helps India do a few different things that it can't do on its own, because its capabilities gap with China is so large as well. It can't alone provide solutions. So on the one hand, the Quad helps build India's own capabilities across a range of things, including, for instance, after COVID, the Quad invested, through the Quad there was an investment in vaccine production facilities in India too. So some of it is very directly helping India's capabilities. Some of it is through consultations. India gets a better assessment of how people are seeing the world. But there's also this aspect that the Quad helps India shape a favorable balance of power in the region that helps deter China. And then finally, the Quad helps offer high quality alternatives in the region, which again India alone can't provide to a sufficient scale.
Ma'am, most of the developed countries are gearing up for a technology race. In that context, how do you think ICET with the USA will help India?
I think what you've seen is ISET is this initiative for critical and emerging technologies that the US and India launched last year. There will be a second meeting this year in 2024. It's supposed to be a facilitating mechanism, and it's supposed to be mutually beneficial. It's again based on this shared convergence, but also shared understanding that there needs to be on both civilian and on the defense side, cooperation in technology. I think the way for India this is useful is technology in and of itself, but technology that can facilitate economic growth and development and innovation in India. So, access to it on the civilian side, access to it on the defense side, and through that an ability for India to build its own capabilities, but also with partners, also be able to down the line offer solutions to other parts of the world. So, the idea is if you have these two countries either bilaterally or through the Quad working on this these set of technology initiatives, they can also offer these solutions, some of them, not all, to other countries as well. A big aspect of ISET is innovation. It's defense industrial collaboration. So, it means again, it means doing things together for each other and for the region, but it also for India the purpose is also building capability at home at the end of the day. So, when people say self-reliance and Atmanirbharta, it is unfeasible to do self-sufficiency, or you take much longer to develop capabilities. What ISET in part helps India do is become resilient. So, build capability. So, it's more kind of self-reliance in the broader sense of the term, is it helps India build capabilities along with partners. Other crucial aspect of ISET, I think, is that it is led by the National Security Councils, which is unique in the US-India history. So, it's an experiment to some extent. It allows cross-ministerial collaboration as well.
Ma'am, in the context of technology, I just have a follow-up question. Recently, Indian government honored Foxconn chairman Young Lee with a Padma Award. What's your opinion on that?
I think this goes, it's actually in some ways very connected to the discussion we were just having about ISET, because partly ISET is bilateral, but it's reflective of a broader value that the US can offer India, and it's connected to Foxconn, even though the chairman is Taiwanese, is that partly you see an American company, in this case Apple, that has made a decision because of their own concerns that they become over dependent on China to start to diversify, not leave China, but diversify their supply chains. That means that they have a number of subcontractors, contractors, subcontractors, and they have actively been pushing them, including Foxconn. It's not that Foxconn wasn't in India before, but the big push has come in part from for a number of these Taiwanese companies to now come and set up here. And so, you have this situation where Taiwan on its own, or this Taiwanese company on its own, but also because the US is saying India is a trusted economic and technology partner. This is a country that like-minded companies and countries should be thinking about investing in. So, ISET has bilateral benefits for India, but it also has these benefits where suddenly a Taiwanese company is thinking, okay, well, this is now fit into this broader like-minded group. Also, there's a copycat effect. Once you had US-India ISET, then France wanted an ISET. Now, others are saying we also want an ISET. You also have a US-India-South Korea trilateral that's just starting. So, I actually think what the Padma Bhushan is reflective of is an acknowledgement of Foxconn investing in building capability in India, in this case industrial capability, but it is part of a larger whole. So, it is good to see India acknowledge that others can play a role in building, helping build industrial capacity in India. There is also this aspect that yes, you can't escape the fact that he is Taiwanese, and it is unusual for the Indian government to acknowledge, officially acknowledge the role of Taiwan. And if you see the listing in the Padma Bhushan, many have gone to foreigners, but most of them have tended to be of Indian origin. So, it is striking in that as well, that he is identified as being from Taiwan.
Ma'am, how can we discuss about USA without taking Trump's name? People think US-China divide came up after Trump entering into American politics. How would you look at this?
I think what President Trump did when he came to office is accelerate the competition. You had already started to see, though, concerns in the US about China start to change in not a positive way. So you'd already seen competition. There were clashes over the, and I mean rhetorical clashes, but also crises over the South China Sea, differences on Taiwan, unhappiness in the US about economic and technology issues. So actually many of the problems India has with China, absent the border dispute, you hear echoes of that in what the US has had a problem with China as well. And aggressive Chinese behavior against pretty much every US ally in the region. So it's not that the US didn't seek a more competitive era dawning with China, and after all, China gets a vote here too. So you saw Xi Jinping, who since he comes to office in that 2013 period, 2012-2013 period, be more assertive and aggressive. Have this view that Asia should be for Asians, not that the US is an unwelcome guest. I think what you saw with President Trump, though, he sometimes alone, but a lot of it was people in his administration accelerate that and enhance that competition. And that is also the time then China reacts in a way. So, and he does it in ways that, for example, maybe the US would have got there, but it would have taken another 10 years. Is he literally, as they put it, it's in both senses of the term, breaks China. And when you have leaders like that just say, put aside all the nuances. So it might have taken 5 years. Suddenly, in 5 weeks, the policy changes, or rhetorically he was tougher. So you do see, I think, that he brought that kind of moment with China perhaps quicker. But what you've seen now, the reason, yes, we've talked a lot about how people and leaders matter, but at the end of the day, structural factors matter. And so the structural reasons for competition between the US and China exist, and that's why you've seen even a Biden administration continue that competition with China and also kind of accelerate it in their own way. So that, I think, has remained fairly consistent. You've seen ups and downs in terms of the nature where the US approach now under Biden administration focuses a lot more on allies and partners, has looked at a lot of these technology controls. But I think largely you see this combination. You see structural reasons for competition, and then you see, a President Trump who comes in and says, this is the way we are going to. The issue with President Trump is, because of the way he sees the world, one thing that will be people in Delhi will be thinking through is he brings a certain volatility. When he first came to office in 2017, he also did a Mar-a-Lago summit with Xi Jinping. So the question for them will be, is he the person who is going to say, because he still says nice things about Xi Jinping, is he the person who's going to continue competition? Or is he going to be the person who gets up one day and says, why is America invested in these alliances and bothering with Asia? We should just be happy in Asia. Let's do a deal with Xi Jinping. So the volatility, for both good and bad, that he brings, where he brings big change, can play both ways. So you will see that being factored in India and frankly in other capitals too.
As you mentioned in your book, nature is bringing India and USA together, but nurture is also required for a sustainable relation. In that context, how efficiently do you think India can maintain its strategic autonomy while dealing with the USA?
So Nirmal, I will say something about the shift, partly because it's now taken for granted. That's why the nature, when I say yes, the nature in the relationship is that both countries have shared theories of the case that fit, that they see the other country is important not just because of China, because of economic, technology partnership, because of values as well, yes. And so the theories of the case for both sides fit. That's the nature part of it. It should be natural. It should be the natural partnership or natural alliance, as Prime Minister Vajpayee had put it. But it requires constant nurture. You cannot just leave it to structural factors. And the reason I mention it is because for your generation, the US-India relationship you see today, we're sitting in Hyderabad, it has one of the largest possibly consulates in the world now. perhaps some of the largest number of visas issued.
Yes.
You have businesses, US and Indian space companies, including from Hyderabad, cooperating. So your generation takes this for granted. But this has required a lot of nurture over 25 years of deepening cooperation, of officials also learning to manage differences and finding ways constantly to tend the relationship. And so, to me, it's, like the Japanese have bonsai plants, it requires constant tending, sometimes very on minute things that can actually be very disruptive. So, part of it is the nurture part. This tending is also means both sides needing, as they work together, develop habits of cooperation, a better understanding of each other, is, for the US has had to learn about India's desire for strategic and decisional autonomy. That India is going to be, it will be a close partner, but it's not to expect that India will behave like an ally. Because sometimes, people throw the word ally around loosely. It means something very specific, which is a security commitment, which is not the case. And so, I think when you ask about strategic autonomy, some of it is the US has learnt over these 25 odd years that that there will be something between autonomy doesn't mean India will not align. It is finding that perfect sweet spot where that India will do things, but it's not going to do it in the way that an ally would necessarily. And also India realizing that strategic autonomy and alignment for India's own interests aren't mutually exclusive or go against each other. That actually aligning with the US, partnering with the US can help build India's capabilities and its role in the world in a way that actually over time will increase India's autonomy. So we often think of this as, India is going to, by partnering with the US, say don't use the word aligning, partnering with the US is going to decrease its autonomy. But these things are also about building codependence. And so you see a situation where you will see the US also start to see. So one way you actually, India protects its autonomy while aligning is by having a more balanced relationship, which is codependent. Not necessarily, codependent in the Indian sense, though, interdependent is another word you could use. I think the second way India will do this is, as India builds its own capabilities, it will feel more comfortable and won't be concerned about over-dependence on the US. And I think the third way India will do this is by maintaining partnerships with other countries, France, Israel, Australia, Japan. So it's hedging against over-dependence through these other partnerships. Finally, we could see a time down the line where India tries to stabilize relations with China, if China plays its part, not to suddenly become friends with China, but to take some of the pressure off. So the need for kind of, having very close relationships, you could see people making the argument that actually stabilize with China. That requires a very different China though, so I'm not sure how likely that is in the near term.
Ma'am, as you said, Hyderabad, it reminded me of event when Bill Gates was the chief guest to inaugurate Cyber Towers, and it made all the difference here in Hyderabad. Moving to the next question, as you mentioned in the book, policymakers during 1949 in Washington were of the opinion that India will be a counterweight to China, and we finished a full circle. Going forward, what factors do you think will affect this triangle, this fateful triangle?
I think quite a few will. I think for one, while we've talked a lot about US-India, China's choices will also matter. So I think how China sees itself, how it is, how its power is growing or stalling, both could lead it to assertiveness. There's a debate about this. So China's capability growth, its behavior, how it sees its role in the region, what it does in terms of contingencies, whether that's at the China-India border, whether that's in the South China Sea, whether that's in the Taiwan Strait, China's choices will shape these decisions. I think second thing is India and US's choices. And these are factors because they're not a given. They can change. And that will also mean capabilities. So to me, it is going to be dependent on also how open in strategic, economic and political terms both India and the US will be. that's another factor, and it's a longer discussion about why each of those things. But I think it's India and the US's choices vis-a-vis each other, how they see China, but also the level of strategic, economic, and political willingness or openness they will have down the line. How strong will they be in each of these factors at home and abroad? And then I think you have factors like other crises around the world. But I think for the bilateral, it's not just going to be the strategic side. How comfortable are the two to push boundaries? But also how strong is the economic relationship, technological relationship? How are the two countries who have very different foreign policy traditions? The US is used to having allies. India is used to not having allies. How do you actually reconcile these two and make the systems fit? To me, those are the kind of things that will shape how what the kind of shape of the triangle will be.
Ma'am, we'll finish this podcast with a rapid fire round. I'll give you a prompt. You have to answer quickly in a sentence.
Okay.
So, first one, describe yourself in 3 words.
That's a tough one. 3 words. Foreign policy nerd.
A quote that inspires you.
A quote that inspired. I feel like I should have got these questions in advance. I don't know. I'll have to think about that one.
Your favorite restaurant.
My favorite restaurant. It changes because I am non-aligned on these issues. So currently, actually, one of the restaurants I'm enjoying in Washington is a Delhi a restaurant group that has set up a restaurant called Rania in DC.
Favorite book.
Mine? No, that's too unhumble. My favorite book actually is a book. I don't know that it's a favorite because again, here too I'm non-aligned. But I think one thing that really struck me and stayed with me is this book called The Metaphysical Club, and it's not about metaphysics. It is a book about how in the US the idea of, I know this is not rapid fire, but I'll just tell you why this is my favorite book. That this is a book that looks at why the theory of evolution caught on when it did in the US. The theory had existed, but it only caught on at a particular time. And to those of us who are in the business of policy ideas and trying to shape the debate or influence how policy is made, it's a constant reminder that sometimes you can have the best ideas in the world, but if it doesn't fit a moment, it might not actually matter. And the reverse is, when you see a moment that your idea has something to offer, you need to make sure it is heard. So it's this book called The Metaphysical Club that has been quite inspirational for me.
Favorite travel destination?
Favorite travel destination? Somewhere new. So it means, sometimes it's Australia, sometimes it's Vietnam, sometimes it's South Korea, sometimes it's Hyderabad. So for me, the quickest answer would be somewhere new.
I thought you would say Lakshadweep, but
if I wanted to be controversial, I would have said Maldives. Sadly, I have been to neither Lakshadweep or Maldives, but as I said on Twitter, I am more than willing to do a deep research assessment of all the Indian Ocean islands and offer a kind of unbiased perspective after that field work of what is the best beach destination in the Indian Ocean.
Your favorite song?
My favorite song? Again, that's one that I wish I had these answers.
Or a current song which you are listening in loop?
Well, the current song that I'm listening to loop. I really don't know.
Okay.
Because you know why? This is the problem these days. I have on Spotify various kind of songs that will come on. Sometimes I don't even know who sung them, but they're just on a loop. So I don't know. Sorry.
Ma'am, if not IR, what would you be doing?
If I had continued to be a techie, I'd probably still be a techie. But the thing that I always wanted to do, probably not very politically correct, but when I came out of undergraduate, it wasn't a possibility. Today it would be. I wanted to open a bar.
Ma'am, that's all. Thank you for being our guest. Please like, share and subscribe our channel. Follow us for more policy related content. Thank you.